All right. Well, first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. This will be the second in the series, and this on the small unmanned aerial systems for agriculture, the Risk and Reward webinar series sponsored by the Southern Risk Management Education Center. This webinar series has been supported by 4 faculty members, starting with Dr. Mingming Gu from Texas A&M, Dr. Joe Marimaha from with the remote sensor engineer at Clemson, Dr. Jim Robbins from the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture. He's the one of the Hort specialists. And then my name is Rusty Rumley. I'm the senior staff attorney with the National Agricultural Law Center located at the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture. The purpose of this particular webinar is going to highlight some of the legal issues and risks surrounding the use of UAVs for agricultural purposes, and we are doing this today with support from the Southern Risk Management Education Center and through USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. I do want to stress that this is an educational webinar, and it's not intended to be or substitute for legal advice. One thing that's important to realize with this particular area, and we're going to touch on it later, is this is a very fast evolving area of the law. So currently it is November 1st when we're conducting this webinar. It's important to realize that if you're watching this recording at a later date, you're going to need to go back and make sure that everything is current, because especially at the state level, there's been a lot of activity in the last couple of years. Also, a lot of materials have been compiled for this particular workshop series. You can see the hyperlink where these materials are available. We have various fact sheets. You're also going to find a bunch of other documents that have been compiled, some dealing with legal issues, but a lot more on various aircraft systems, sensors, some great materials on all of the other issues that are discussed throughout this webinar series. So I highly recommend spending a little bit of time and going through those resources. I think they'll be extremely valuable to anyone that's wanting to get into this particular area. So when we're getting into the use of unmanned aerial systems for agricultural purposes, there's a lot of particular areas that come up. The purpose of today's session is we're going to look at privacy and nuisance issues, and we're also going to look at liability and insurance. The other 6 series of the webinar are going to go through all of the other the various areas. We're just going to focus on these 2 for the purposes of the webinar today. So a little bit of the legal landscape for the use of UAVs in agriculture. We're going to talk a little bit about how we got here, why the laws have developed the way they have. We're also going to look at the state issues such as tort law. That's where we can see we foresee the most potential impact for people using these UAVs either for business or for recreational purposes. We're going to talk a little bit about insurance, what it does do, what it doesn't do, what things that you should be watching out for when you're thinking about purchasing a policy. And then finally, we're going to end up with when do you know that you need a license? So there's actually another section conducted by Dr. Robbins where he talks about the licensing process in greater detail and tells you how to get started on it. We're going to end today's discussion with how do you know when you need to look into the licensing process. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So one thing that's important to realize with any legal topic is history matters. So a lot of things, the way we do things now, it doesn't make sense why we would do the things that we do if it wasn't for the fact that we had some historical significance on the reasons why we do it. So we start off with the very old common law legal doctrine called the ad coelum doctrine. It's not something that's really followed anymore. However, it's the basis for things such as your mineral rights for people that have oil and gas wells on their property or other things like that. It basically stated that the landowner owned their land from the center of Earth all the way up to the heavens and stars above. They quickly found out with the advent of aviation that this doctrine was no longer going to work, as people were continuously suing for airplanes flying over their land in the airspace. This was actually a fairly controversial issue. Going through the legal scholarship, there's a lot of law review articles, there's a lot of cases working their way through the court systems at this time. What is a nuisance? Who's trespassing over whose land? At what altitude do you need to fly so that you're not infringing with someone else's property rights? All of this stuff was hotly contested during that time. Congress in 1926 passed the Air Commerce Act, where they went in and basically they took dominion over the airspace. So they are allowed to set up the airways, they license pilots, they issue the airworthiness certificates, all of which this has all been turned over to the Federal Aviation Administration. They also set up what is going to be considered navigable airspace. And what they ended up doing was they basically said it's 1,000-foot over populated areas such as towns and 500 foot everywhere else. And if a plane was flying in this navigable airspace, they're going to be presumed not to be trespassing or a nuisance as they fly over. And this buffer area that they set up ended up, by and large, taking out a lot of those nuisance and trespass claims. There's still a few that happened over the years, but it significantly reduced the number of lawsuits that they were seeing with this, by instituting this buffer zone. So Congress set up this buffer zone. We've also had some other cases that have came up since then wanting to know, well, we've got this buffer zone, but exactly how much rights does that landowner have to that airspace that's immediately above their property? And the way the courts have looked at it is basically to say, what kind of beneficial use is that landowner putting to the land? And are they actually using that airspace? So if you're using your land to construct a high-rise building, you're obviously going to have a much greater use of that airspace than you are if you're someone that's farming potatoes or some other crop that grows largely beneath the ground. So it's end up with a kind of a flexible standard based upon how much of the airspace above your property are you actually using. So we end up with this gray area in this 500 to 1,000 foot down to the surface of the land. The other thing that's important to point out, the FAA has defined aircraft as an extremely broad term. It's basically anything that's intended for flight in the air with or without an onboard pilot. So because of this, I mean, it basically covers not only all manned aircraft, but the vast majority of unmanned aircraft as well. Because FAA was given pretty much carte blanche authority over this particular area, one of their directives, one of their major directives is to promote the safe flight in U.S. airspace. So that gives them the authority to look at things such as aircraft safety, pilot training, air traffic control, anything relating to the safe operations of flight. That term, that safe operations of flight, that ends up being really important when we get into the state areas of law. And like I said, they also define the term aircraft extremely broad as basically any contrivance invented, used, or designed to navigate or fly in the air. So we've actually asked questions to the FAA how broad this is. Pretty much any UAV is going to be considered an aircraft. The only time it is not flying is if it is flying inside of a building. Tethering the UAV to the ground with a rope or a string, it doesn't matter. It's still considered an aircraft. They will go out and say that they do not view kites or hot air balloons as aircraft, but you know, many other things that you might think wouldn't be considered as aircraft FAA may disagree with you on that particular interpretation. So it's something to watch out for. State issues. So as I said earlier, the FAA's job is to promote the safe navigation in U.S. airspace. They're looking at safety issues. They're not looking at tort issues. And that was actually when the FAA passed the small unmanned aerial systems regulations for licensing. There was actually comments to the effect that, wow, it would be great if the FAA came out with standards that all UAS operators in all 50 states could just comply with this one set of standards. And FAA quickly pointed out that no, this was not in their area. They handled the safe operation of U.S. airspace. They did not get involved in areas such as privacy, trespass, or anything else. So that opened the door for the states to legislate in these particular areas, and the states have been very prolific in their attempts to introduce and pass legislation dealing with the UAS access throughout the United States. And you can see here just a couple of examples. By now, there's only a handful of states that do not have any type of UAS legislation, and most states have multiple bills that have been passed into a law affecting how, when, and where people can fly UAS. So we're mainly going to focus on the state issues. The federal issues, by and large, relate to safety and training. They're covered largely in the other sections of the webinar series. We're going to be looking at what are some of these state requirements that are being used, that UAS operators are being asked or forced to comply with. There's a wide range of state topics out there. So what I've tried to do for brevity's sake is to try to combine these into 3 basic areas, realizing that there are other types of statutes that may not fall into one of these 3 categories in a nice and neat manner. But we're going to look at privacy, nuisance, and trespass. A lot of these laws that have been passed on the state level do have a privacy component to it. Typically, they work by either making the capture of images from a UAS a crime under certain circumstances, or a lot of them actually focus less on private use of the UAS and more on the use of these UAS by law enforcement members. So you're going to have to look at your particular state's law to see how the privacy provisions in that law, who they affect, whether they affect all citizens and law enforcement, or whether they only affect law enforcement officers. We started out with a good example here from the state of Texas. They've passed a fairly robust privacy statute for the use of UAS, and I'm not going to read the statute verbatim, but if you take a look at the language, you'll see that this is extremely broad. They're looking at capture of an image, and the image isn't just pictures or videos. It can also include thermal images, any type of electromagnetic waves, odors would count as images, or any other capturing any other conditions is existing on or above the property itself. The one thing in this statute that provides a bit of a limitation is it has to be done with the intent to conduct surveillance. So this is a little bit of a help there to people that are wanting to use this for agricultural purposes. When you're flying these UAS, you're going to find out that if you're trying to take data from a particular field, you're not only going to, you can't just stay right above the land. You're going to have to overlap that land, and you're going to have to fly beyond it. And it's very possible that during the myriad of pictures that you're going to be taking of the land, you could end up taking pictures of property that you don't own or that you really didn't intend to view. So long as the purpose of your data collection was not to conduct surveillance on the neighbor's land, you're still going to be okay under the Texas statute. They also provide all kinds of exemptions. Of course, military and law enforcement, utility companies, the UAS is becoming extremely popular for use for inspecting things like natural gas pipelines or for high voltage electricity lines. And they've also carved out exceptions for researchers as well. An interesting thing about these privacy statutes is they've incorporated portions from things like voyeurism statutes, and not only is the taking of these images a crime, it's also a crime to be in possession of these images. So if someone takes pictures through the UAS with the intent to conduct surveillance and they send them to somebody else, that other person can also be found guilty of a misdemeanor just for the mere possession of those images. Idaho is another state that's got a good example. In Idaho, they had passed a law that's colloquially known as an ag-gag statute, basically preventing surveillance, undercover surveillance of farming operations. They also included a segment in on the UAS statute, extending that privacy towards the farms themselves. This is going to be interesting to see how this is viewed, because the ag-gag statute itself, the statute that the language on the UAS statute was basically modeled off of, was recently declared unconstitutional under the First Amendment, as restricting free speech. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But that just kind of goes to show you a different way where privacy has been is being looked at out there. The other, another major area that we're kind of looking forward to seeing how this develops is with nuisance in the aircraft. So nuisance itself, it's a fairly old crime, or a fairly old tort. We see this quite a lot in agriculture. Typically, it's defined as an unreasonable interference with another's use and enjoyment of their property. We see this with things such as anything that causes substantial amounts of odor or noise or dust or light, anything that could either devalue neighbors' properties or cause them to restrict their usage of their property. So these are not a new thing. One of the first ones I could find involving aerial nuisance, this case was actually from 1928. So it's not uncommon to see these types of nuisance claims. Where you tend to see them is with low-flying aircraft. And why is this an issue with the UAS? It's because, by definition, all of the UAS are going to be low-flying. So kind of going back to those early 1920s, 19-teens, when the aircraft industry the aviation industry was really taking off, Congress carved out this buffer zone from basically 500 feet and down, and this was meant to ward off these types of nuisance and trespass claims. Where this becomes an issue with UAS is that buffer zone that Congress initially created to protect people flying from these lawsuits is the exact area where they've said that the UAS operations is going to occur. So we're kind of expecting to see an uptick in nuisance litigation just because the airspace that the FAA is designated for UAS is exactly into that buffer zone that was originally meant to curtail that. So things like helicopters hovering, all of that stuff, it's happened in the past, it's going to happen again. But we have this thing called the restatement of torts, and this is not the law. This is basically scholarly work where professors have gone in and tried to synthesize cases from across the country to come up with not hard and fast rules, but general rules that are generally applicable across the country. And what they found by reviewing the cases out there involving aircraft is that anything that they basically said, any aircraft flying below 50 feet is a trespass, and then there's this gray area that occurs from 50 to 500 feet, and that's going to depend upon the facts and circumstances. Everything above 500 feet would be covered by the Air Commerce Act, so those things would not be considered to be a nuisance or a trespass. They're thinking about manned aircraft at this point, fairly large aircraft. So we do have this general statement of law, but this could be a problem for the usage of UAS. Not so much in the direct use in agriculture, if you're keeping the aircraft immediately above the property that you're trying to look at, but if you're trying to use UAS such as for transporting packages, or you're flying from one field to another and you're going to be crossing someone else's boundaries, this right here could open people up to liability. One of the #1 questions we get here at the National Ag Law Center dealing with UAS is we get calls from the next door neighbor that didn't realize that their neighbor had purchased a drone, and that one day all they see is they look out their window and notice that there's a drone hovering around in the air, not typically over their property, but in easy sight of their property. So they're wanting to know, the question is, can I shoot it down? And there's actually been a lot of product development occurring in this area about what to do with drones that are trespassing over your land or invading your property. We've got a picture of one of the products. There's an interesting warning on it. It says, package, this should not be used for illegal activities. So what might you ask is an illegal activity? Shooting at any aircraft is an illegal activity. So 18 U.S.C. Section 32 deals with aircraft, and if you remember back to that definition of aircraft, it's basically any contrivance that flies through the air. So this applies not only to manned aircraft, but potentially to unmanned aircraft, since they're all defined as aircraft. So it's actually, it could be considered to be a felony to discharge a firearm or do anything that interferes with any type of aircraft that's in the U.S. airspace. This is actually an area that at the government level they're trying to change right now. There's been instances of people flying drones over fires, over criminal investigations, and interfering with law enforcement or first responder activities. Some states, such as California, has already passed laws allowing law enforcement to take down unauthorized drones. They're trying to do the same thing for around prisons. Drones are being used now to deliver contraband to inmates. The FAA has not been particularly happy about people trying to carve out exceptions for what aircraft can be shot down over the continental United States. So this is one area that's by the day is changing. So it's going to be interesting going forward, what actions can and cannot be done to control drones. There are some companies now that are trying to set up what's basically called geofencing, and what that would do is you would designate your property as a no-fly zone for UAS, and then as newer drones are manufactured, the onboard software would be updated to reflect that your property is a no-fly zone, and that they wouldn't actually be able to fly over your property. The software in the drone would actually steer it around your property to avoid flying over it. So they are coming up with new technological solutions to this particular problem that don't involve downing the UAS with either a firearm or some other type of instrument. Insurance. So switching on over to a slightly different topic, we're going to talk about insurance. So insurance is, most people are familiar with insurance either from homeowners or car liability insurance. A couple of things to point out on insurance. And the major thing that you need to think about with insurance, whether it's your home policy, a farm policy, or a UAS policy, insurance companies make money by collecting more in premiums than paying money out through claims. Anytime they're paying out more in claims than they're taking in premiums, they're losing money. So this is a business aspect. So insurance is a good thing to have, but it's not a perfect defense. So we're going to talk about some of the potential limitations to insurance policies and things that you need to watch out for in your contracts. Well, first thing, and this applies to all insurance policies, is you need to read the policy extremely thoroughly before you purchase it. By and large, the first couple of pages will talk about how great the insurance policy is and all the things it'll cover, and then the remainder of the document will go through all of the exclusions to your policy. So it's a good idea to think about on the front end what you're going to be using your UAS for. Are you going to be flying it over other people's land? Are you using it for commercial purpose? How large is your UAS? How expensive is your UAS and your equipment? And you're going to want to use that information to determine what kind of coverage that you have. Just because you receive a contract and one of the things that you want is included in the exclusions, it does not mean that you cannot get that particular coverage. Typically, you can negotiate with the UAS insurance provider, and they can issue an umbrella or a rider to cover that particular issue. You're going to have to pay a little bit more, but it's typically most things you can negotiate out what things can and cannot be covered. From the UAS policies that I've seen, they typically are only going to cover physical accidents caused by the UAS, and it's typically going to be crashes. So some policies will cover damage caused by the crash. So if you crash your UAS into someone else's automobile, it's going to pay for things like, body work and paint on the vehicle for whatever damage was occurred. Some insurance policies will also cover damage to the UAS itself. But you do want to go in there and check and make sure, especially if you have an extremely expensive UAS or you've got a lot of expensive equipment, you're probably going to want to make sure that your insurance policy not only covers the damage caused by your UAS, but it also covers the damage to your UAS and any equipment that it may be carrying at that time. As Jim likes to point out in some of his presentations, Newton's laws still are at play. What goes up must come down, and sometimes those things will come down in a violent manner. People that have been flying UAVs for any significant length of time, all of them have crashed and all of them have destroyed a UAV. So just realize that it may be necessary to have some kind of coverage on the UAS itself. One thing that is important to point out is, so far I've never seen a policy that provides tort protection as well. So if your neighbor does sue you for trespass or nuisance or invasion of privacy because of your use of the UAS, I've never seen one yet that will cover things like paying for your attorney to represent you in the defense against these claims. Or if you are found to be liable by a jury, it's not going to cover the damages that are assessed against you. So just realize what your insurance does cover and what it does not cover. And typically speaking, many of the legal issues, such as the state level tort issues, are not covered by insurance. So who should purchase it? Honestly, it doesn't matter too much who purchases it. You're just going to want to make sure that anyone that needs to be covered by the policy is named as an additional insured. So you want to make sure that everyone who could be covered is. So if you are buying the UAV and you have a business entity and you're going to be the pilot, make sure both the business entity is covered and you as the pilot are covered as well. So make sure that everyone's covered that you need. Also, just because you have other types of common insurance policies such as general farm, homeowners, car insurance, it probably doesn't mean that you're going to be protected for the operation of UAVs, even under a general farm policy. Read your farm policy carefully, contact your insurance agent and see if it's covered. If they do say it's covered, make sure you get that response from them in writing.
Little tunnels, but they're very nice tunnels. Look forward to seeing you on Friday. Thanks. Bye.
So the other thing on the insurance front is to make sure that your insurance agent's aware of any changes that you're going to do. Typically, they will send you a letter if they are changing the policy. Make sure you read that letter to see what changes are in the policy. If you talk with your insurance agent and they tell you certain things are covered, make sure you confirm that in writing. Send them an email saying, here's what we talked about. If anything is in error or if I'm misremembering something from the conversation, please let me know. So at least you've documented that you have talked about this and you've been assured that you do have coverage on this particular area. Licensing requirements. So this kind of gets into the beginning of Jim's presentation in session 3. The FAA is essentially divided UAS operations into 2 basic categories: the recreational/hobby use and then work use. Work use has been further divided into general, commercial, and then government. But either one of it, whether it's the government/university or whether it's general commercial use, they both fall under the basic work use requirements. So we're just going to talk about them as 2 basic categories. The other reason why we're talking about it in 2 basic categories is under the recreational and hobby use, you do not need a license. Under the work use, you will need to have a license from the FAA. So seeing which category you fall into is going to be critical. Now the UAS or the FAA has published requirements, what your pilot requirements are, what your flight requirements are, what your operating rules are. And what you're going to find out is for the hobby use, it's very permissive. There's no age requirements. You need to stay at least 5 miles from an airport unless you notify air traffic control. You have to keep it under 55 pounds. And so long as you're flying for just the pure fun of flying or for some educational purpose, that's just about all of the requirements you're required to follow. Yield to other commercial aircraft, listen to the control tower if they do, but by and large, this has not been that large of a big of a problem. We are seeing a big change, though, for commercial use, and people have been asking, if we've had these recreational uses of UAVs for decades and we've never really had a problem, why are we imposing these additional requirements on commercial use? And the reason for that is because of all of the new commercial uses, there are many, many, many more UAS in operation today than there was even 4 or 5 years ago. So they're seeing an absolute explosion on the use of UAS, so they're trying to get their hands wrapped around this particular issue before more safety concerns arise. So the big question is, when do I need a license to operate? What I tell farmers is that if your usage of your UAS will let you deduct the cost of that drone from your income tax, you get to write it off as a business expense. If you can write it off as a business expense or you can justify it as a business expense, you need to be licensed by the FAA. So if you're buying it for fun, you're not going to need a license. But if you're going to use it for anything, viewing fences, spraying crops, crop monitoring, anything like that, anything that would allow you to deduct it on your federal income taxes, you're going to need to go out there and get a license. Their definition of what is commercial or work-related is extremely broad. It's not just, are you hiring out your services to someone else? Using your own drone on your own property is still required. You're still required to have a license, even though you don't ever leave your property if you're using it for some kind of business purpose. So like I mentioned earlier, we actually have a lot of resources that have been compiled by the team. They're on that web link that I told you guys about and earlier on, like the 3rd or 4th slide. There's pages and pages of links talking about everything from the UAS systems themselves, the software, how to use the software, how to interpret the images. There's information on insurance companies and links to those various insurance companies. We don't advocate the usage of any one insurance company. We're merely providing some links to some of the common ones. I'm sure if you search the internet, you'll be able to find more. Here's some that we were able to come across. You can use these to compare and contrast and see which one fits your needs the best. So with that being said, I would like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar on the legal issues with UAS use, and I hope that you guys will tune in for the other webinars that have been produced under this series. Dr. Gu, I'll turn it back over to you.